Hello, everyone. My name is John Sierra, and I'm a Tolkien scholar. And what that essentially means is that I have dedicated a rather large portion of my life to studying the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. If you have any sort of question about, say, The Hobbit, or The Lord of the Rings, or The Silmarillion, or any of his other stories, or really anything to do with Tolkien at all, I'm the person that you can ask. And if you want to ask a question, you can go ahead right there in the comments and ask me, or you can come by one of my streams. We usually stream on Thursday nights. Most every Thursday night. There are some that I don't, and of course you can keep an eye on the community tab as well for scheduling and whatnot. Or you could use a website called Quora. So Quora is a knowledge-sharing platform, and all the questions and answers that I feature in the videos were first asked and answered by myself on Quora. It's a knowledge-sharing platform where you can ask any sort of question and have people with relevant knowledge or expertise or experience answer your question on really any number of subjects that you can think of. And what's really cool about it is that once you ask a question, it will figure out what topic your question is, and it's going to recommend you people that you could ask it of. Of course, anybody can answer any question, but you can also ask specific people to answer your question. If you ask any sort of question about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, on there you're going to see a list of names. My name is going to be at or near the top of the list. And of course, there's a link to my Quora account in the description of this video, which you could use that as well. And there's also my Quora space, which is called the Grey Havens. So anyway, I had a lot of fun with last week's episode, and I'm hoping to have a lot of fun with this week's episode. We do have 10 questions to get through, and some of them are rather lengthy answers. Not all of them, but some of them are. And of course, I would like to do reading for you. And today we're going to read from The Return of the King, being the third part of The Lord of the Rings. And what's really interesting about this is this section that I want to read is specifically Aragorn talking about when he spoke to, or didn't really speak to because he didn't actually use any words, but I should say when he communicated with the Dark Lord Sauron through the Palantir that had been taken from Saruman, or I should say it was not really taken from Saruman, it was more thrown at them by Grima Wormtongue. And even then, we're not really sure, and I think it's a great thing that's open for interpretation, when Grima through the crystal, was he really aiming at Gandalf and Théoden and all of them? Or was he aiming at Saruman? You know, the text can go both ways in that instance. I like to think that he was aiming at Saruman, but that he was sort of making it look like he wasn't. You know, I don't know. But that's sort of my take on it. I want to know what your take is. Do you think that... leave a comment. Do you think that he was aiming at Saruman, or do you think he was aiming at Gandalf specifically? Or is he just throwing it in rage and not aiming it at any sort of particular person? Did he just want to get rid of it for some reason? You know, there are a lot of ways to interpret that passage. But anyway, that happens in The Two Towers. But what's interesting is Aragorn doesn't talk about his experience with the Palantir until the chapter The Passing of the Grey Company, which is the second chapter of The Return of the King of Book 5, which is the first half of The Return of the King. And this is the chapter where he's going to take the paths of the dead, and the dead men of Dunharrow will join him, and they will take on the corsairs of Umbar and free the slaves on those ships, and then use and then of course the dead men of Dunharrow pass from this world, and Aragorn and the freed slaves and the Dunedain and Gimli and Legolas and all of them go up the river, to Minas Tirith, where the Battle of Pelennor Fields is happening. And of course, Sauron's forces were expecting those ships to come, but they were expecting the Corsairs of Umbar to be on them. And it's one of my favorite chapters overall, but I want to read specifically the part where he talks about his communion, we'll say, with Sauron. There wasn't a conversation, there weren't words passed, but it was a test of wills. And we're going to read that section. I think I'll start a little bit before that, though, here. Let's start here. Aragorn was silent for a moment. 3 days, he murmured, and the muster of Rohan will only be begun. But I see that it cannot now be hastened. He looked up, and it seemed that he had made some decision. His face was less troubled. "Then, by your leave, lord, I must take new counsel for myself and my kindred. We must ride our own road, and no longer in secret. For me, the time of stealth has passed. I will ride east by the swiftest way, and I will take the paths of the dead." "The paths of the dead," said Théoden, and trembled. "Why do you speak of them?" Éomer turned and gazed at Aragorn, and it seemed to Merry that the faces of the riders that sat within hearing turned pale at the words. "If there be in truth such paths," said Théoden, "their gate is in Dunharrow, but no living man may pass it." "Alas, Aragorn, my friend," said Éomer, "I had hoped that we should ride to war together, but if you seek the paths of the dead, then our parting is come, and it is little likely that we shall ever meet again under the sun." "That road I will take none the less," said Aragorn. "But I say to you, Éomer, that in battle we may yet meet again, though all the hosts of Mordor should stand between." "You will do as you will, my lord Aragorn," said Théoden. "It is your doom, maybe, to tread strange paths that others dare not. This parting grieves me, and my strength is lessened by it. But now I must take the mountain roads and delay no longer. Farewell." "Farewell, lord," said Aragorn. "Ride unto great renown. Farewell, Merry. I leave you in good hands. Better than we hoped when we hunted the orcs to Fangorn. Legolas and Gimli will still hunt with me, I hope, but we shall not forget you." "Goodbye," said Merry. He could find no more to say. He felt very small, and he was puzzled and depressed by all these gloomy words. More than ever he missed the unquenchable cheerfulness of Pippin. The riders were ready, and their horses were fidgeting. He wished they would start and get it over. Now Théoden spoke to Éomer, and he lifted up his hand and cried aloud, and with that word the riders set forth. They rode over the dike and down the coombe, and then, turning swiftly eastward, they took a path that skirted the foothills for a mile or so, until bending south it passed back among the hills and disappeared from view. Aragorn rode to the dike and watched till the king's men were far down the coombe. Then he turned to Halbarad. "There go three that I love, and the smallest not the least," he said. "He knows not to what end he rides, yet if he knew, he would still go on." "A little people, but of great worth, are the Shire folk," said Halbarad. "Little do they know of our long labour for the safe keeping of their borders, and yet I grudge it not." "And now our fates are woven together," said Aragorn. "And yet, alas, here we must part. Well, I must eat a little. And then we also must hasten away. Come, Legolas and Gimli, I must speak with you as I eat." Together they went back to the burg. Yet for some time Aragorn sat silent at the table in the hall, and the others waited for him to speak. "Come," said Legolas at last, "speak and be comforted and shake off the shadow. What has happened since we came back to this grim place in the grey morning?" "A struggle somewhat grimmer for my part than the battle of the Hornburg," answered Aragorn. "I have looked into the stone of Orthanc, my friends." "You have looked into that accursed stone of wizardry!" exclaimed Gimli with fear and astonishment in his face. "Did you say aught to him? Even Gandalf feared that encounter." "You forget to whom you speak," said Aragorn sternly, and his eyes glinted. Did I not openly proclaim my title before the doors of Edoras? What do you fear that I should say to him?" "Nay, Gimli," he said in a softer tone, and the grimness left his face, and he looked like one who has laboured in sleepless pain for many nights. "Nay, my friends, I am the lawful master of the stone, and I had both the right and the strength to use it, or so I judged. The right cannot be doubted. The strength was enough. Barely." He drew a deep breath. It was a bitter struggle, and the weariness is slow to pass. I spoke no word to him, and in the end I wrenched the stone to my own will. That alone he will find hard to endure. And he beheld me. Yes, Master Gimli, he saw me, but in other guise than you see me here. If that will aid him, then I have done ill, but I do not think so. To know that I have lived and walked the earth was a blow to his heart, I deem, for he knew it not till now. The eyes in Orthanc did not see through the armour of Théoden, but Sauron has not forgotten Isildur and the sword of Elendil. Now, in this very hour of his great designs, the heir of Isildur and the sword are revealed, for I showed the blade reforged to him. He is not so mighty yet that he is above fear, nay, doubt ever gnaws him. But he wields great dominion none the less, said Gimli, and now he will strike more swiftly. "The hasty stroke goes oft astray," said Aragorn. "We must press our enemy, and no longer wait upon him for the move. See, my friends, when I had mastered the stone, I learned many things. A grave peril I saw coming unlooked for upon Gondor from the south that will draw off great strength from the defence of Minas Tirith. If it is not countered swiftly, I deem that the city will be lost ere 10 days be gone." "Then lost it must be," said Gimli. "For what help is there to send thither? And how could it come there in time?" "I have no help to send, therefore I must go myself," said Aragorn. "But there is only one way through the mountains that will bring me to the coastlands before all is lost. That is the Paths of the Dead." "The Paths of the Dead," said Gimli. "It is a fell name, and little to the liking of them to the men of Rohan, as I saw. Can the living use such a road and not perish? And even if you pass that way, what will so few avail to counter the strokes of Mordor?" "The living have never used that road since the coming of the Rohirrim," said Aragorn, "for it is closed to them, but in this dark hour the heir of Isildur may use it, if he dare. Listen, this is the word that the sons of Elrond bring to me from their father in Rivendell, wisest in lore. Bid Aragorn remember the words of the seer and the Paths of the Dead." "And what may be the words of the seer?" said Legolas. "Thus spoke Malbeth the seer in the days of Arvedui, last king at Fornost," said Aragorn. "Over the land there lies a long shadow, westward reaching wings of darkness. The tower trembles to the tombs of king. Doom approaches, the dead awaken. For the hour is come for the oath-breakers. At the stone of Erech they shall stand again, and hear there a horn in the hills ringing. Whose shall the horn be? Who shall call them from the grey twilight, the forgotten people? The heir of him to whom the oath they swore. From the north shall he come. Need shall drive him. He shall pass the door to the Paths of the Dead." So there we have it. Really a lot going on in this section, and I'm going to go over just sort of a few key points here. Once I silence the system sounds that I was hearing. They are silenced. That must have been my phone I was hearing then. A few things to talk about here. So let's start with the most recent, the words of the seer. They talk about Malbeth the seer, and we really don't know much about Malbeth the seer, but he mentions it was in the days of Arvedui, the last king at Fornost. So Fornost was a fortress in the north, in the land of what that was once called Arnor. It was a part of the greater realm of Eregion. Well, Eregion wasn't really a realm in such that... I'm not Eregion, I'm sorry. Eregion is something else. I can't think of Eriador. It starts with an E. Eriador. Eriador is not so much a realm as it's a region. And Arnor was a realm within it. It was part of the realm of Elendil, which was sundered into two pieces, the north part being Arnor and the south part being Gondor. And at some point, the realm of Arnor was also sundered into three separate realms, and this happened because the king of Arnor died, and then the next one after that, his eldest son was going to become the king, but then he had these two younger brothers that were like, well, we want to be the king, and there might have been a civil war, there might have been strife, so they decided to just split the realm into three pieces, which became Arthedain and Rhudaur and Cardolan. And Arvedui was one of the kings of Arthedain, and he actually, at some point, because he was Isildur's heir, tried to become the king of Gondor. And he came to Gondor, and, the stewards and the council said, no, you can't be the king because you are of the line of Isildur, and we only recognize kings that come from the line of his brother Anarion. And, that doesn't really hold up that much, because while Isildur was considered a king of Arnor, he was also the High King. He just didn't get to establish the kingdom in Arnor. It is likely that he was going to have one of his sons be the king of Arnor, and that he would be the High King of both realms, just as Elendil was the High King, and he was the king in the north, while Anarion was the king in the south. But once the realms became separate, they no longer recognized anyone who was descended from Elendil, including the heirs of Isildur, they only recognized Anarion because they started to think of Arnor as a completely separate realm from them, not what was part of a whole. And it's sort of like symbolic of like the whole thing, like his sword broke in half, his realm broke in half, everything sort of broke into two pieces. And, Arvedri actually had a really good argument, though. He said that he was married to a Gondorian princess I believe she was one of the many Firiels. Tolkien had a lot of characters named Firiel. Not all of them were in the Legendarium, although one was the subject of a poem that is told of the Legendarium. Perhaps I'll read that one day, and we'll talk about the last ship and everything. But what's really interesting is he said, she should be the queen of Gondor because, she was the son of the king, and they said, well, we don't have women as rulers. I said, well, that's funny because Númenor did, and aren't we Númenorians? And they didn't really have an answer for that, but it really was up to them because even though they were of Númenor, they weren't Númenor. They were a post-Númenorian society. And what was really interesting is that the tradition in Númenor initially was that only men would be king. And it was one of the kings, his name was Aldarion. Tar Aldarion changed it because he didn't have any sons. He didn't want his cousin to become king after him. He wanted his daughter to become the ruling queen. So that was one thing I wanted to talk about there. Another thing is, let's talk about Aragorn. Aragorn has a lot of foresight. He probably has more real foresight than any mortal man character in all of the Legendarium. And I'm even the wise women of the House of Haelith, such as Andreth and Arathel, Adanal and Andreth. They were often wrong in their scrying. They made prophecy, but I think that most of the prophecies they made were false, whereas Aragorn has foresight that always turns out to be true. He says to Éomer that we may meet in battle again, yet the host of Mordor will be between us, and that is indeed what happens, where we see that Éomer is coming from one end when he flies into his berserker rage because he thinks his sister is passed, and his uncle rather, he knows is passed, and then from the other side is Aragorn, and they actually meet in the middle, which is a great scene in The Return of the King. And he also talks about the hasty stroke goes off the stray. We must press the enemy, because Gimli says that this news that Sauron has received, that this old enemy of his, this Strider, is actually the heir of Isildur, and that he is going to be the king. And he thought that line was done. He thought Strider was just some guy that was his enemy, and this is going to make him want to attack sooner, and that actually works out really well because it's going to empty out Mordor of a lot of their armies, and it's going to make things a lot easier for Frodo and for Sam in crossing across Mordor, because you can imagine if there were hundreds and thousands of orcs there, it would have been very impossible for them to get to Mount Doom. It was even pretty much impossible even with so few orcs there, and they did even get caught at one point. Of course, they managed to get out of that. Another thing that I wanted to point out here, let's see, what was it? Was it about Mary? I don't think it was, actually. Actually, I think that might have been it. That might have been everything that I wanted to... Oh, yes, it was sort of about Mary. It was when Halbarad said, "A little people, but of great worth are the Shire folk. Little do they know of our long labour for the safekeeping of their borders, and yet I grudge it not." And of course, we know that the Rangers of the North, the Dunedain, were watching over the Shire and protecting it, and part of it was because, Gandalf asked them to. But I think they also just really wanted to keep those people safe as well. But yeah, it's interesting because, once again, those realms in the north, they faded, they fell. Rhudain and Cardolan became barren, and then it was really just Arthedain, and then eventually there was no king in Arthedain, and the closest thing was the Thane of the Shire, which will eventually be Pippin, actually. But anyway, that's all we have to say on that reading there. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you have any questions about it or interpretations you want to speak about, of course, you can leave me a comment. We're going to get to the questions now. We have 10 fantastic questions to get to today, so let's start with the first one. Our first question comes in from Ben Dean Hui, I hope I'm saying it right, who asks if Sauron managed to get Durin's Bane and Smaug to be his allies during the Second Age, could he have defeated Númenor? Well, Sauron did defeat Númenor. He just did it his way rather than doing it Morgoth's way, which would be the traditional way of just fighting them. It would be a mistake to think that Sauron's surrender to Pharazôn was anything but a calculated move. Of course, the armies of Pharazôn were mighty. But Númenor was really more of a naval country than anything, and Sauron could have fought a very long war with them, and I think he eventually would have won, even if it would be a very long war and very costly for him. In surrendering, he was able to get directly to Númenor and facilitate its destruction, or I would say more accurately, to hasten its destruction, because this was it. This was already sort of the end of their culture. Pharazôn was the king. He wasn't supposed to be the king. He seized the kingship by force, by forcing his cousin Tarmiriel to marry him. She was supposed to be the queen and the ruler of Númenor. He was not of the faithful. They were already a fallen people, and Sauron, getting there and getting in the king's head and becoming his friend eventually, he hastened the destruction of Númenor, and he did it his way. He did it with subterfuge and subtle arts and seduction. Smaug was probably not born yet in the Second Age. We don't really know when he was born, and dragons do live for a very long time. But Smaug's appearance was towards the end of the Third Age, and the information that we have about Smaug sort of suggests that he's a younger dragon. Durin's Bane would, of course, be a mighty ally to Sauron, but also keep in mind that he was dormant throughout the entirety of the Second Age. He only was, woken up in the Third Age, in the middle of the Third Age. Even then, he didn't come out of Moria until he was essentially forced to by Gandalf, and then he was, subsequently killed. It would be incredibly unlikely for Sauron and Durin's Bane to cross paths in the Second Age. So, maybe there could have been some other dragon that might have helped him or whatever, but doing it that way, just fighting Númenor head-to-head like that, was a very sort of Morgoth move. Sauron liked to do things in more subtle ways, and we see that to great effect in the Akallabeth. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Banazir, that's Samwise Gamgee himself, who asks, why did the ring tempt Boromir? Frodo's quest seemed impossible, and it's surprising he even got to Mount Doom without being caught, while Sauron panicked when he thought the ring was in Gondor. Wouldn't the ring want to go to Mordor instead of Gondor? No, the One Ring would much rather go to Gondor. The question actually sort of answers itself. Frodo's quest seemed hopeless. Aside from the fact that getting the One Ring to Sammath Naur was a miraculous feat, no one could willingly destroy the One Ring. Regardless of this, Frodo is still going in that direction, and he's showing no signs of wavering. Now consider Bilbo and Gollum, both of whom wished to keep the ring, but had no desire to actually use it for its intended purpose. Gollum may have become even worse from holding the One Ring, but he still held it for centuries without ever wishing to wield it in a way that would get the attention of Sauron or his disciples. Then there was Bilbo, who resisted the ring's corruption far more than Gollum did. It only used it as essentially a toy. Now, the ring passed to another hobbit, this one determined to destroy it. Now, Frodo was stronger than Boromir in this. Boromir was a man who was strong of arm, and he was strong of will, but he was not strong of spirit. If he took the ring for himself, and it would have been for himself, not for his country, he would have undoubtedly tried to actually use it. And in doing so, he would expose himself to Sauron, who is stronger than him in every possible way, even without the ring. Gondor could not hold forever against the armies of Mordor. Eventually it would have fallen, and Sauron would have retrieved the ring. Frodo, on the other hand, even if he failed, that doesn't necessarily lead to the ring being found and brought to Sauron. What if he was, for example, eaten by Shelob, and then the ring recovered by Gollum? Gollum would not deliver the ring to Sauron. Gollum hated Sauron more than anything. He would have taken the ring and gone someplace deep and dark, and he would keep it for even more centuries, if not millennia. In going with Frodo, there is a chance of destruction, but it's a small one. But there's a greater chance of the ring just being lost or falling into the hands of somebody like Gollum. However, if it was seized by someone like Boromir, who had the mind to attempt to use it against Sauron, Sauron's victory would be assured. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in. I've not seen this before. It seems to be anonymous. Quora told me that this is a follow-up question. It says that it's a follow-up question to a previous answer. It doesn't tell me what answer that it is, or who wrote the follow-up question, or anything like that. So I really don't know what that's all about. But it's an interesting question, and I thought it was a pretty well done. So, how did Sauron's perception of Aragorn as a threat differ from his view of Saruman, especially when it came to the ring? What's interesting was that the ring doesn't actually come into this discussion all that much. I think Sauron, though, I think he had a lot of respect for Aragorn that he didn't have for Saruman. Sauron, of course, he saw Aragorn as a foe. It's plain and simple. He never attempted to barter with Aragorn or reason with Aragorn, and Aragorn didn't really attempt to treat with him. Their only contact was via the Palantir. That's why I read that scene earlier. As far as we know, neither of them spoke. We know for a fact that Aragorn didn't say anything because he said he didn't say anything, but we don't really know if Sauron said anything, but I don't think he did. Aragorn showed him the Elisar, he showed him Anduril, which is the sword of Elendil reforged, and through his force of will, he wrested control of the Palantir of Ithil from Sauron. Now, Sauron is not said to have said anything to Aragorn. As a matter of fact, the only spoken line of dialogue that we have in The Lord of the Rings from the character who's actually the Lord of the Rings was said to Pippin, which was a mocking message that was to be passed on to Saruman. Aragorn mentioned that he had been a foe of Sauron's for quite some time, and many a time Sauron had attempted to destroy him through his agents, when he just thought of him as Strider, this ranger from the north. It's sort of a thorn in his side, and these attempts all failed. Sauron likely had, I think, a grudging respect for his enemy, even as he hates him. And before anyone rushes to the comments to say that you can't hate somebody and respect them, that those two things are mutually exclusive, or that the evil characters cannot feel respect for their foes, remember that Tolkien explicitly stated in The Return of the King that Saruman looked at Frodo with a mixture of hatred and respect. So, on the other hand, Saruman to Sauron is sort of a useful idiot. They are not friends. They're not even allies. Saruman is working against Sauron. He's just doing it in the most wrong way that he possibly can. Sauron, for his part, is not easily deceived. Aragorn manages to, and put this in quotes here, deceive Sauron by not lying to him, or in fact speaking to him at all, but rather allowing the Dark Lord to jump to his own conclusions. By contrast, Saruman openly lies to Sauron, and Sauron is aware of the deception from the start, but is quite happy to allow Saruman to play act at being his minion and trouble his enemies in Rohan. Saruman, in trying to do good, did great evil. And while he did not serve Sauron, he served Sauron's goals. Sauron only tolerated Saruman as far as he was useful to him. It's something that Gandalf was aware of. He stated that if Saruman surrendered to him, giving up his staff and the key to Orthanc, that he would be free to go anywhere, even to Mordor if he wished. Though, of course, he knew that Saruman would not fare well in Sauron's graces after having failed to defeat Rohan. And to make matters worse, and this is the tiny bit where the ring sort of comes into play, Sauron now believes that Saruman let the One Ring slip between his fingers and let it pass to Aragorn. So characters usually show Aragorn respect pretty quickly, even the evil ones do. The exception was the mouth of Sauron, who openly mocked Aragorn, but all it took was Aragorn's steely gaze to have the coward begging for his life, after which Gandalf pretty much told him that he was an idiot and to get out of their faces. I think Sauron never saw Saruman as any sort of real threat. His mind broke just from talking to him in the Palantir, and he fell from grace hard and fast. On the other hand, Aragorn not only stood up to Sauron through the same Palantir, but wrested dominion of it from him with no might of arm or with even words. To accomplish what Saruman could not do mentally made Aragorn a foe to be respected and feared. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Billy God's Grace, who asks, does Sauron try to rule Middle-earth also for wealth and to become rich by exploiting the economic resources of the free peoples? No, wealth was not his primary goal. He didn't really care much for money. He did covet mithril, but that may not have been for monetary gain. There's a connection between evil and gold in Tolkien's work, and it's explained in the book Morgoth's Ring. Morgoth, who is the satanic figure of Tolkien's work, put his essence into the world itself, much like Sauron put his essence into a ring. The book proclaims that all of Middle-earth was Morgoth's ring, though he was mostly focused on the northwest portion of the continent temporarily. It also states that the essence of Morgoth was not evenly distributed throughout all matter, but it was disproportionate. It was found in gold in higher amounts and water in lesser amounts, to use two examples there. Due to this, some creatures of evil tend to hoard wealth, such as dragons, like Smaug. Even though it serves no practical purpose for them, they can't ever spend it. It also accounts for the dragon's sickness, as seen in Thorin II Oakenshield, or the Master of Esgaroth, who became quite greedy around large amounts of gold, and they made decisions that were rash or detrimental to their well-being. Sauron, though, is quite a bit above all of this. That's not to say that the Dark Lords are never greedy. Morgoth was covetous, but he tended to covet light, not wealth. Sauron covets control. His wish is to control others and to dominate them. He sees himself as the heroic Lord of Order defending the world from chaos. So in his mind, freedom is chaotic, so everyone must be brought to heel. Sauron does covet mithril, which is more valuable than gold, but this may have had a practical reason. While the likes of Smaug cannot spend money, Sauron actually can. He even offered to pay Rohan for their horses, resorting to stealing them once they refused to do business with him. He is known to bargain and to barter, and those of his troops that are not either magically compelled into his service or conscripted as slaves are actually paid. Examples include the Corsairs of Umbar and the mercenary forces of Khand. Mithril, however, has more practical applications than just acting as something that's valuable. It is possible that Sauron wished to fashion weapons or armor out of mithril for his greatest servants? Sauron, as ever, is far more practical than the likes of Morgoth, whose main goal was to defile all of creation, while Sauron wishes to bring order to creation, or at least his twisted view of what order is. Any despot needs paid goons to enforce his will, and he certainly would wish for his greatest servants and generals to have the most magnificent arms and armor. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question is from Tomislav, who asks, do you agree that the films made Théoden seem way less sympathetic and likable than he is in the novels? And if so, why do you think they did that? I think overall I don't agree. I think the issue with Théoden is minor, and it's mostly contained in a single scene. I'm going to put a meme here. Did you read it all? Okay. It's still there. I just wanted to talk. This part, yeah. Other than that scene, I think that any issues with Théoden's portrayal in the Peter Jackson films are quite minor. One could talk about characters that were completely mangled, like Denethor and Faramir, or characters that were, I think, misunderstood, like Frodo, or characters that were underutilized or left out, and the list is long on that. But my overall estimation of the films is that they're excellent. I just personally disagree with a few decisions. Théoden seemingly being reluctant to aid Gondor when Aragorn mentions that they will be needed, this seems sort of ridiculous compared to his book counterpart, who, after defeating Saruman, is already preparing to muster his troops to aid Gondor when the official request comes in, which was a rider with a ceremonial arrow, not the beacons. The beacons are actually used to gather troops from other parts of Gondor to go to Minas Tirith. And that's not a complaint, by the way. The beacon lighting scene was amazing, even if it wasn't in the book. This whole idea was just to create some tension and some suspense so that when the official request does come in, there's a pause where the audience, at least the great many that never read the book, they wonder for a moment, how is he going to react? Of course, Gondor wasn't there when the Westfold fell. They weren't aware of it. Théoden did not ask for aid, nor was he in any frame of mind to do so, as he was under the control of Grima Wormtongue and by proxy Saruman. He wasn't even aware that his son had perished until he was brought out of this trance. What brings us to the other scene where Théoden acts a little bit off, which is when he tries to kill Grima, and he's stopped by Aragorn. Théoden was all too happy in the book to allow Grima to prove his loyalty, the loyalty that Grima was still professing, that he will believe in him again if he rides out to war with his king. And Grima, he chose to flee because he's a coward, and Théoden ordered his troops to not stop him and to give him even a horse if necessary, although Éomer had this sort of snarky comment where he wonders if a horse would even bear him. I can certainly sympathize with the movie version of Théoden for wanting to make short work of Grima after all the horrible things he's done. But so that part doesn't really bother me as much. Some people point out that he banished Éomer in the films, but not in the book. But it was, once again, a decision that wasn't made by him. It was made by Grima. And even in the book, Éomer admitted that he had, and this did happen. He just knew that the order was not coming from Théoden himself, and that Grima had some sort of unnatural control over the old man. The only other major change is that in the film, he was more directly possessed by Saruman rather than just, gaslit into believing that he was weak and ineffectual by Grima. Though by through the coaching of Saruman, and this is also minor, I think. I feel Théoden's Westfold speech is ignorant, but that his overall betrayal is very good, especially when you compare him to the likes of Denethor. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Brad Dickerson, and this is an interesting one because this is an example of if you send me a question and I don't answer it, maybe I have passed on it for one reason or another, and it could just simply be because I've recently spoken about that and I don't want to repeat myself so soon. But sometimes I let a question sit there for a while because I'm not in the frame of mind to answer it right away, and I want to come back to it. And this is one that came in like weeks ago, and I finally got to answer it. I was finally feeling in the frame of mind to answer this. So here's the question. Where did Sauron get the food to build an army in Angband after Morgoth's capture? So this isn't something that's spelled out in any book or any letter. So we must use a bit of conjecture. Now, using a bit of educated conjecture, or what Tolkien referred to as strong surmise, it is easy to come to any number of conclusions as to how Sauron provided food for Melkor's army in Angband. We are told that in the latter second and third ages, providing for his troops was a simple matter of employing slaves who worked in the fields in southern Mordor, where the lands were very fertile. This is more complicated by Angband's location. It's not very complex, but it's a little complicated because we don't really have a really good pinpoint on exactly where Angband is. It's not actually on the maps that are provided with the Silmarillion. Now, while we have no reason to believe that Sauron and the rest of them stayed in the fortress the entire time, the exact location is not on the map, and we have to sort of figure out where it is to start figuring out what their food source would be. Now, of course, and this was pointed out in the comments, Angband is huge. There's vast tunnels under it and everything. They would have stores of food, but the food has to come from somewhere. So that's really what we're talking about here. Now, we know that it's near the sea and that it's nestled in the Iron Mountains. This is not to be confused with the Iron Hills. And the Iron Mountains, the Ered Engren, are not seen on any official Beleriand maps that are actually done by Tolkien or his son Christopher. In the primitive maps that we have of Middle-earth during the spring of Arda, the Iron Mountains are the very northernmost mountains that span the entirety of Middle-earth. So to pinpoint the location of Angband, we can take context cues here. It was in the northwest. It was near the sea, and it was part of a mountain range that was not seen on any of the First Age maps. When Balrogs came to Lamath from Angband, it was said that they passed over Hithlum. So I'm going to put a map up here. Now, this is not an official map. It's a very nice map, but it's not an official map. And this determines the location of Thangorodrim and Angband to be north of Dorthonion. And this is a very popular idea, but it sort of flies in the face of the Silmarillion stating that Angband was close to the sea. And I'm going to read you the passage that says that. And Melkor made also a fortress and armory not far from the northwestern shores of the sea, to resist any assault that might come from Aemon. That stronghold was commanded by Sauron, lieutenant of Melkor, and it was named Angband. The location shown in the map is more likely to be where Melkor's former fortress, Utumno, was, while Angband was further to the west near the sea. This would place it in an icy waste where there isn't really a good place to work the land close enough to the fortress to be practical, and it would satisfy the thought that it was an outer fortress and armory meant to defend Utumno against Aemon, which was unsuccessful, of course. Putting Angband north of Hithlum also satisfies the idea that Balrogs would have to travel across parts of Hithlum to reach Lamath. All this to say that while the Mordor sort of idea of working nearby fields probably wouldn't have worked so well for Sauron in the first age as it did for the latter second and third ages, they were near the sea, and so they had access to fish. I can imagine Sauron and his engineers coming up with devices to catch great numbers of fish all at once. And another idea is that while food was probably scarce to grow where they were, it could be stolen or it could be ransomed, and this wouldn't feed an army, but it would supplement the main source of sustenance, which I think came from the sea. My last thought on the matter of provisions is that Angband was also connected to other sites throughout Middle-earth via underground tunnels, and this is how Durin's Bane got under the Misty Mountains after all. So these tunnels could work as supply lines for food or any other sort of provisions or supplies to be brought surreptitiously from other sites to Angband. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Wyn Griffiths. I almost said Wayne, but it's not Wayne, it's Wyn Griffiths, who says, in the Fellowship of the Ring, what were the gifts given to Sam and Boromir by Galadriel? Sam got dirt and Boromir got a belt. Each gift that Galadriel gave to the Fellowship served an important purpose, though in the case of the golden belt that she gave to Boromir, it was kind of a macabre one. The belt doesn't do much, it's just a belt, and then it's, not very many chapters later when Boromir dies. Faramir later sees Boromir's body floating by in the boat that Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas put him in for his funeral. He recognizes his brother, but he was missing his horn, and he had a golden belt about him. Faramir states that this vision was dreamlike, yet not a dream, because he did not wake. It may be a vision that he saw, rather than actually having, laid eyes on Boromir's body. Either way, upon recounting this to Frodo told him that this was Boromir as he remembered him, and that the belt was given to him by Galadriel and Lorien. This helped Faramir come to grips with his brother's death, and vision or not, he knew that it was true, for he saw something in it that he did not recognize. The box that Galadriel gave to Sam contained fertile soil from her own orchard, which contained her own blessing. She stated that if he sprinkled this dirt in his garden, it will be the greatest garden in his country. Contained within was a malern nut, which led to Sam planting the only malern tree in Middle-earth outside of Lothlorien. His gardening was important in restoring the Shire after it was befouled by Saruman. All right, let's move on to the next question. The next question, this is another one of those follow-up questions. I guess when people ask follow-up questions, it doesn't tell me who's actually doing it. But here it is. Why was the Witch King so shocked when Éowyn faced him in battle, and how did this affect his defeat? He was shocked because people don't generally face him. They usually run screaming in the other direction. The Witch King projects a powerful aura of fear that mortals can rarely stand against. All of the Nazgul do this, in fact, but the Witch King specifically, at this point in the story, had been empowered with what Tolkien referred to as extra-demonic force by Sauron. When the Witch King entered Gondor, all of the men and all of the horses fled before him. No one fought him. Only Gandalf, who was an angel, and Shadowfax, who was the most noble horse in Middle-earth, possibly descended from Orome's steed, stood resolute. Gandalf not running from him is one thing, but this simple Rohirrim? Éowyn's courage was enough to give the Witch King pause, though how shocked he was really up for debate. He paused briefly after telling Éowyn that no man may hinder him, and she simply replied that she was a woman. It wasn't so much that he thought a woman might hinder him, but the absolute gall of somebody to just sort of clap back at him like that made him realize that he's not up against an ordinary person here. And gawking at how daring this rider of Rohan was being to him was enough to give Merry his chance to get into position and to gather his courage and to strike the Witch King from behind, and that, of course, it was pretty much over for him because Éowyn was able to kill him at that point. All right, let's move on to the next question. The next question is also a follow-up question, and so, once again, I don't know who asked it. Why is Morgoth still considered a Vala, even after being so powerful and evil, and what exactly is his role compared to the other Valar in Tolkien's universe? For what it's worth, he was the only one who really considered himself to be a Vala. And that doesn't matter as much as you might think it does. As far as the Valar were an order of the Ainur that had specific functions, Melkor had been cast out of their order pretty early on. He went to war with them almost as the very first event to happen in the world, and they departed to Aemon without him. Even when he was later captured and brought to Aemon in chains after spending 3 ages in Mandos, and then being forgiven, there was no indication that he sat in council with them or was able to make any sort of governmental type decisions that they did or really had a function. He was just let out. He was sort of, out on parole. As for, far as Vala, though, meaning power, because that is the literal definition of Vala, and that's a title given by the elves to the 15 most powerful of the Ainur that entered into Arda. And he still was very powerful, and nothing could take this away from him. It was the elves who came up with these terms, Vala and Maya, and even though his power diminished from being too spread out, his power still all existed within the world. His power wasn't broken until the world would be broken. Even when he was expelled from the world, so much of his power is still left behind, just dissipated all throughout Middle-earth. Reminding Feanor that he is still a Vala is mostly just to make Feanor think a certain way, and it's true. Melkor certainly had to know that Feanor wasn't going to entrust the Silmarils to him, but in referring to himself as a Vala, he puts an idea in the elf's head, and later when Melkor takes the Silmarils for himself and he destroys the 2 trees, Feanor has this thought that the Valar are going to side with Melkor instead of him because, he's their brethren. And this isn't true, but in sitting in the circle of doom and silence, the Valar seem to be doing nothing, and they're allowing Melkor to get away with it. And Feanor was angry, and he was emotional, and he was impatient, and he was arrogant, and he didn't account for the way that time passes for the Valar and even for the elves, and he didn't account for how the Valar communicate to each other without words. Either way, much of Melkor's actions in Aemon leading up to this had been poisoning Feanor's mind. The fact that Feanor was off in a fortress by himself to have this conversation with only his father to keep him company instead of being Tyrion with all the rest of his kin and his kith was due to Melkor pitting Feanor against his half-brother Fingolfin. So this whole idea of him, I'm still a Vala. I mean, he's not in the circle of doom. He's not making those decisions. He's not helping run the world. He's just, like I said, he's sort of out on bail. And, he's saying that to put an idea in Feanor's head, and it was very, very successful. All right, let's move on to the last question. Our final question is an anonymous one, and it's not one of those weird sort of follow-up questions where I don't know who wrote it. It's an actual, just anonymous question. Here it is. Why does Gandalf call Bilbo a burglar in The Hobbit? Does he know that Bilbo would be going on an adventure with him? In reading The Hobbit, Gandalf, just suddenly being like, hey, you know what, Bilbo, I'm going to send you off to deal with this dragon. You'll like it. Seems very random as far as Bilbo's perspective is concerned, and it becomes far more clear after reading the book Unfinished Tales. From Bilbo's perspective, he was just enjoying being chubby and rich when Gandalf came along, and he made the mistake of saying good morning to him, which started this whole sort of Joe Pesci, what do you mean I'm funny, comedy routine, and then yada yada yada. Suddenly he's wearing an evil artifact that makes him invisible, and he's talking to a dragon about riding on barrels. Things escalated really quickly. From Bilbo's perspective, Bilbo was respectable in Hobbit society, or at least he thought he was. He certainly tried very hard to be respectable in Hobbit society. He never did anything unusual, though his barometer for unusual was skewed by Hobbit standards. He was just blissfully unaware of this. He invites Gandalf for tea, and pretty soon there's a horde of dwarves eating all this food and saying he doesn't seem like much of a burglar, which is something that he never claimed to be. But Gloin wounding his pride, and then Gandalf giving him a little push, both figuratively and literally, and then suddenly he's off on an adventure. So let's back up. The early parts of The Hobbit get recontextualized in Unfinished Tales in the story The Quest of Erebor. Gandalf states that he had met Thorin and realized that he was the son that Thrain had told him about when he found him in Sauron's dungeon. He gave Thorin the map and the key that his father had passed to Gandalf, and Thorin was quite hot to trot to build an army of dwarves and attack Smaug, taking back his kingdom. However, Gandalf knows that this is going to fail. He would either not be able to get enough of a force and thus be unable to stage an attack, or he would be hot-headed enough to try anyway, and it would end in disaster. Gandalf also had other things on his mind, primarily Sauron himself and the oncoming raid by the White Council to drive him out of Mirkwood. He worried that Sauron might put out a call for evil creatures to aid him, and that such a powerful creature such as Smaug might come to Sauron's aid and complicate the whole thing. He decided that Thorin's adventure must coincide with his own, but he must also assure that Thorin's task is successful. Realizing that Thorin wasn't going to be able to defeat Smaug, he suggested a more subtle approach, and to do this he would need a burglar. He suggested a hobbit, as they are known to be able to move quietly and quickly, and they were subtle creatures. Gloin had, perked up thinking that hobbits were all simpletons, but Gandalf assured him that this was not the case. He thought of specifically Bilbo immediately, though he admitted to the captive audience that he's telling this story to, which was Frodo and Sam and Merry and Pippin and Gimli, that he may not have mentioned Bilbo if he knew how fat and lazy the Hobbit had become. There was hope, though, and this goes back to my earlier comments about Bilbo believing himself to be respectable by Hobbit standards, but his barometer, off. Not only was Gandalf specifically looking for him, but he had been by on a previous day and Bilbo was out and about. Apparently Bilbo celebrated the Elvish New Year, and he would go off into the woods that elves used to cut through the Shire on their way to Lindon, hoping to meet some elves. His neighbors knew about this, and they thought he was a bit touched in the head. So Gandalf had met Bilbo previously when he was very young, likely when he was an early tween, and the lad was just, full of beans. He had dreams of going on an adventure and using a sword instead of a walking stick. By the time it came time for this adventure to happen, though, Bilbo's 50 years old, and he's much more concerned with whether he should have seed cake for breakfast or have 2 seed cakes for breakfast. I want to take a brief moment to highlight Gandalf's feats. One of them is destroying a Balrog and dying in the process, and then being resurrected and returned to the world. The battle against Durin's Bane lasted 11 days. You might say it was not exactly an easy thing for Gandalf to do, especially since he was already weary when the Balrog appeared before him. However, Gandalf said that the most difficult thing that he ever had to do in all of his time in Middle-earth was not defeating the Balrog or leading the armies of the captains of the West against Sauron along with Aragorn and Imrahil, but rather convincing Bilbo to give up the ring to Frodo. Okay, reasonable enough. It still involves the One Ring, and therefore there's a powerful magical allure there. Sauron's involved. However, he then said that the second most difficult thing that he ever had to do in Middle-earth was convincing Thorin to take Bilbo with him. That's how much of a pain it was for him to explain to Thorin that this bumbling hobbit had greatness in him. Gandalf had great foresight, and he knew that Thorin needed a burglar, and not only did it need to be a hobbit, but it needed to be this specific hobbit. He told Thorin, look, you're either going to take Bilbo or I'm going to wash my hands of this whole mess. And Thorin agreed with great reluctance, especially as Gandalf preyed upon his superstition of having a party of 13. Of course, convincing Bilbo that he was a burglar was a simpler task. He simply put a sign on Bilbo's door stating that he was a professional burglar or treasure hunter, advertising his services. Bilbo, of course, had no such plans, but he got talked over a lot by the dwarves and by Gandalf, and all it took was a rude comment from Gloin to make him want to prove that he's any good. And, of course, he could have said, hey, look, very sorry, chaps, but there's clearly been a misunderstanding. I'm no burglar. Please enjoy the evening, and I'll see you off at breakfast in the morning. Good luck with the whole dragon thing. Which brings me to why it had to be Bilbo specifically, not merely because of the grand aspirations that he once had in his youth, but due to his heritage, the mixture of fiery and adventurous Took, one of his ancestors fought goblins after all, and the sensible and thoughtful Baggins, he had to have a fire within him, but he also had to be the reasonable counterpart to Thorin. It was the Took in him that got him to go out on the adventure. And it was the Took in him that bailed out the dwarves from trouble time and time again, but it was the Baggins in him that gave the Arkenstone to Thranduil and Bard in hopes that the entire thing could be resolved peacefully. So anyway, I had a lot of fun with today's episode. That's all the questions for today. If you've reached the end of the video, here's the part where I ask you to subscribe. If you haven't subscribed already, this is the time to do so. There is never going to be a better time to subscribe, and that is a total lie, because it's always a good time to subscribe. You know what? Right now is an even better time. If you didn't do it then, now is even better. Just click the subscribe button, leave me a comment, do the thumbs up thing. All of these things are engagement. Engagement helps the algorithm. The algorithm helps the channel grow. That's really just how it works. It's both simple and complicated at the same time. And if you want to support me in an even bigger way, consider membership. If you join the channel as a member, you get to see all of the videos early. Some of them, the regular Q&A videos a week early. Some of the other videos several weeks early at times. And it's a really cool thing. You get to have special badges and emotes and stuff during the streams. So that's all really cool. And plus you get to help me out, and it's really not that much money. So consider membership. We're trying to reach 20 members. I think that's like a really cool number to be at. And we got close. We got to 19, and then it dropped down to 17, and now we're at 18. So let's come on. Who's going to be number 20? I want to know who member number 20 is. Anyway, I'll see you guys next time. Send me your questions. Send me your comments. I'll see you here. I'll see you on Quora.